Hello, I'm Catherine Clark, and welcome to a special Remembrance Day edition of Beyond Politics. Over the past several weeks, I have had the privilege and the honor to interview 4 veterans who have served in either the Second World War, the Korean War, or in Afghanistan. I'm pleased now to introduce my interview with Donovan Redknap, who served in the Canadian military for many years and who fought in Korea. Retired Major Donovan Redknap, known as Reg. It's wonderful to have you here. Thank you for joining me.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
How did you become known as Reg?
Well, when I joined the military and I went to Borden to officer candidate school, in the platoon, there were 30-odd of us. And after a few days, and we were sitting around in the evening, having done all our chores, somebody said, we should all have a nickname. And everybody, okay, we'll all have a nickname. And somebody said, Don, you look like a Reg. I don't know what brought that on. But everybody suddenly said, hey, that's a good name for you. This is in June of 1951, and I've been known as Reg in the military ever since. Nobody knows me as Donovan.
Except your wife.
Except my wife.
That's
yeah.
right. How did you end up in Korea?
Well, this is where I have to give you a little bit of prehistory to that.
Sure.
I had finished grade 13 in Guelph in 1949. There was no money for university, and my father was a First World War vet, and we lived on a disability pension. And so I went to work. I went to work at CIL in Toronto. And then in 49 and 1950, first of all, Canada joined NATO, and then the Korean War broke out. And the Canadian forces were desperate for junior officers, second lieutenants and lieutenants. They had a lot of leftover captains and majors and colonels from the Second World War, but the junior officers had all gone off to university or something, and so they actually advertised for young men who had grade 12 or grade 13 to apply. So I applied. I went before a board of officers and then did a few tests, written and verbal, had a physical, and the next thing I knew I was on the bus for Camp Borden in officer cadet basic training. So that's how I became part of the military.
Your dad had served in the First World War,
yeah.
So you would have had a clear understanding of what war was about. Why would you sign up, especially in a situation where Canada was actively involved in a war? Why would you sign up knowing that you could be sent into the same kind of situation? Well,
I usually tell people that maybe 10 or 15% of that was patriotism, and the rest of it was adventure. You know, I was 21 years old, and when you're 21, nothing's going to hurt you. You find out differently, but at that stage in life, and many people who went to Korea were like the soldiers, there's something like 27% of them were Second World War vets. So they knew about war, but they went anyway.
How long until you were sent to Korea?
Well, I did. I joined in June of '51. I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the artillery in February of 1952, and then did further training with a regiment, my regiment that I went to Korea with, and we finally went to Korea in March of '53.
How long did it take you?
16 days.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, 3,000 troops on on a ship, and no booze. How's that?
Well, that's a long 16 days.
Americans don't allow booze on there. Anyway, and we went to, as I said, we sailed out of Seattle.
Right.
And let me tell you a little story before we sailed. This is all to do with Korea. About a half an hour before the ship sailed, an American military bus pulled up to the bottom of the gangplank. And first thing, 2 military policemen with shotguns got out and stood each side of the door. Then 2 more got out and came up to the top of the gangplank. And then out of this bus came 40 American soldier prisoners in chains. And they were marched up the gangplank, marched to the front of the forecastle of the ship, and then down to the hold in the front. And they were there for 24 hours until we went to sea.
Why?
Because they were soldiers who didn't want to go to Korea. Of course, in those days, the Americans, these were all conscripts. They weren't volunteers.
Right.
And they deserted, they'd been picked up, they'd been put in prison. And so their punishment, they were going to go to Korea whether they wanted to go or not. But we all said at the time, I would hate to be the officer who got these people, because they would not be good soldiers. But anyway,
Yeah.
that was the first. I'd never seen anything like that in my life before, and neither had anybody else in the Canadian contingent. So it was a kind of a shocking thing.
So after 16 days at sea, you arrive.
In Yokohama, in Japan.
Okay.
And from there, Yokohama, we went by train down to Kure, which is in the southern part of Japan, which was the Commonwealth reinforcement base. Like in Korea, we fought as the first Commonwealth division. Australians, British, Canadians, and New Zealanders. There had never been a Commonwealth division before Korea, and there will never be another one again. It was a unique. Anyway, we were down there for 48 hours while they indoctrinated us again about, don't get trench foot, don't get infected by the ladies, all sorts of, all the.
What's trench foot?
Oh, if you don't, it was a very prevalent thing in the First World War. If you don't change your socks and your feet get wet and you don't take your boots off for some time, you get trench foot, which is terrible sores on it's like a gangrene thing almost. So the thing is, you must always carry a dry pair of socks somewhere on your, and take your boots off when you can. That's trench foot. Well, let me tell you a quick little story. When we arrived at Kure, we were, the Japanese little chalets, bamboo and paper. Well, I was a second lieutenant, and we got put in one of these places. Each person had a room. And as soon as I got there, in the room, I got to have a shower. So I stripped, it was, as far as I was concerned, it was a batch. I just stripped down and went down the hall there was a communal shower down there, 6 shower heads or something. And I got in there and having my shower, and suddenly I heard this chatter and laughter, female. And down in the hall and into the shower came a half a dozen. They were house girls, who did all that. They came in to have a shower.
At the same time as you?
Yes. They paid absolutely no attention to me.
You must either have been horrified or thrilled.
Yeah. Very embarrassed was the word. Anyway, so I quickly, sort of got out of the shower, went back to my room, and I got to the room, no clothes. They were all gone.
Oh, no.
Everything else was in a duffel bag, which would all be wrinkled. So, what am I going to do now? So I sat on the edge of the bed for a while. And in about 20 minutes, in came one of these little girls with my clothes, the shirt and pant, everything clean, pressed, folded. Just gorgeous. Anyway,
That's remarkable.
Yeah, that was my introduction to the ladies of Japan. Anyway, we took it, and then we took a ship over to. This time they were British ships, and we landed at Busan, now called Busan. Now, even before when we got even close to the shore, you could smell Korea. You could smell it.
What was the smell?
Well, part of it was the refugees in Busan, and part of it is they use human excrement on their fields and on their rice paddies. And I don't know if they still do that, but they certainly did in those days. And the smell could be out to sea. Anyway, the ship docked, and we marched from the ship to the railroad station because we had to take a train to go north for part of the trip. Well, that's the part that really affected me in Korea. The railway station in Busan sits in a valley, and all around there are cliffs and hills. And those cliffs and hills were filled with people. They were refugees living in shacks made out of paper and cardboard and corrugated. No sanitation, nothing. And you know, I'm a boy from Canada. This is before TV. Today you see all this on TV, but I had never seen anything like that in my life before, to see people in these kind of conditions. And it really bothered me to see people living like this.
Did it reinforce, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I will, did it reinforce your understanding and commitment?
Oh yeah,
why
in
you
a way,
were there?
Yeah, you know, to help these people. Yeah. And then anyway, we got on the train and we traveled only at night because the North Koreans and the Chinese had snipers in the south, and they would take pot shots at the train if they could. So we traveled with blacked out windows and at night only. And we traveled all that night and arrived at the railhead just behind the, well, about 10 miles south of the front lines. And then we transferred into trucks. And then we were driven then to the rear area of the 1st Commonwealth Division and said, okay guys, you're here for the night, the rest of the night. Put your sleeping bags on the ground, and in the morning we'll go north to your positions. So that's the only time I really felt apprehensive about it. I'm lying on the ground in the night. The guns are rumbling to the north, and I said to myself, Redknap, what the hell are you doing here? You know. Anyway, as dawn broke, all those feelings went away, and we got into the vehicles again, and we went to our designated areas. And artillery, a regiment of artillery has three batteries of guns in those days, and each battery has 8 guns in 2 separate troops.
Did you see battle?
So the first thing that would happen with us, you heard the name Teddy Leslie, who's the general that just retired. Well, his father was then the CO of 1 RCHA, a lieutenant colonel. And his name, he was a McNaughton, from the famous McNaughtons of the... But for $250,000, he was left $250,000, but he had to change his name to Leslie. That's why he became a Leslie. I would change it for $250,000 too, even though Redknap's unique. But anyway, that's what he did. But he was then the CO, and everyone was scared stiff of this. He was a very fierce fellow. And just to test us, before our CO took over, he called down a Mike target. A Mike target is a target which all the guns, all 24 guns of the regiment take part in. And he was just testing to see if we were as good as we thought we were, or if they weren't as good as we thought we were. Anyway, we were as good as we thought we were. So he was happy to turn over command from him to our CO. So, but anyway, we make sure the guns are correct. One of the big things in artillery is you try to correct make sure there's a double check on everything, because you don't want to shoot at the wrong place, at the wrong people. It happens, but in theory it shouldn't happen. So that's how a battery operates. And we took over a lieutenant who was already there, Joe Devlin, as the command post officer. I was the assistant command post officer. And what you do is you just do different shifts. And we used to do a 24-hour shift. We had a little cot in the command post. And he would do a day, 24 hours, and I would do 24 hours. I better get to this battle.
Sure.
Okay. We had been there in 2 or 3 weeks, and the RCR, the 3rd Battalion, which is the battalion that my battery was supporting, they were being bombarded. For 13 straight days, they were bombarded. And on the 13th day, at night, they sent out a fighting patrol, 13 or 14-man patrol, out into no man's land to try and ambush whatever. But they were in turn ambushed. This is the night of 2nd, 3rd of May, 1953. They were in turn ambushed by the Chinese. And the lieutenant who was in charge of them, he was killed. And then another patrol went out to try and rescue them, and that officer was killed. And by this time it's midnight, 2nd, 3rd of May. And that's when the Chinese, because they had been gathering, that's when they attacked 7th Platoon, which was the forward platoon in this company's area, attacked to overrun them. And that's when we fired the DFSOS. We had been firing out in no man's land trying to help this patrol. But this is the time we were told to fire DFSOS in front of, which was right in front of 7th Platoon. But that did not stop the Chinese. And they did exactly what you're talking about. First ones came through the minefield. Second wave threw themselves over the barbed wire. Third wave over their backs and and they actually started to overrun 7th Platoon. And the platoon commander, his name was Ed Hollier, he just died here last year, a good friend of mine. He tried to get most of his troops into the slit trenches and bunkers, and then he called down fire from me on the top of his position, not on the ground, but in the air, airburst. I got this message because the radios weren't working very well. I got this message through my battery commander, who was up with them by landline, by phone, so I didn't hear this message. The signaler writing it down, and then he wrote it. He read it back to them, and I'll always remember the order. And it said, reference DFSOS, which we had fired. Oscar Tango, that's the line observer target, 360 degrees, drop 200, Victor Terror, which is a variable time fuse, fire until ordered to stop. Now, I hadn't heard this. I just got it from... That was going to put the fire right on the top of 7th Platoon. So if somehow it wasn't the right order, we could be in bad trouble. So I picked up the phone from the operator, and I knew Jamie Stewart, my boss, was on the other end, and you don't normally question fire orders, and second lieutenants don't question majors. But anyway, I said, sir, if I fire this, it's going to be right over the top of 7th Platoon. And he said, Reg, I know that. Just do it. So anyway, we fired it, and there was some further fighting. Then we fired again, and then eventually the Chinese withdrew. It was coming up close by this time, close to first light. And that was the heaviest casualties that any... That was the fourth major battle that Canadians had fought in Korea, and it was the costliest one. There were 26 RCR killed, 2 of my gunners, and there were 25 RCR wounded, and 7 were taken prisoner. So it was a bad night.
You know, at the beginning of the interview, how you talked about part of the majority of the reason that you had joined was for adventure. On a night like that, when you suffer casualties and you lose people in your own group, did you question the decision? Did you think, okay, I've had enough adventure now? Or
No. We were at war and we were there. By this time, peace talks were going on. So we knew at some stage this is all going to end. So you're not going to quit now. You know,
So if you can give us a non-X-rated version, can you tell us what happened on your leave?
Everybody in Korea got 7 days.
How often?
Just once.
Oh, in 14 months you got 7 days?
Right.
Good. That's quite short.
And we flew out of the airport, out of just south of Seoul. On American, we used to call them crash masters because a number of them crashed, but they were 2-level, cram a lot of troops in them. And it took us to Tokyo. And there was a leave hotel run by the Australians. Because the Australians they had a big part in Japan after the war, and they were still running things quite a bit. And first thing I did was get into a hot bath. I haven't seen one of those for a long time. And
it must have felt so good.
Yeah. And then we all got, well, 3 or 4 of us. We walked out the door of the hotel and walked down the street. And the first sign we saw was outside a building. And it said, cold beer, warm meals, and hot girls.
How long were you in Korea?
14 months. Mainly because you're supposed to do a year. But when it came our turn to go home, there wasn't anywhere to put us. And finally, I think it was May of 54, and the CO came around and said, okay, we now have our orders, we're going to Camp Utopia. And we all said, where the hell is Camp Utopia? In fact, it's in New Brunswick, but it's not Utopia, I can tell you that. Especially not for second, well, I'd just been promoted, especially for single lieutenants. It's not the best place to be. Anyway, that's
You had a long career in the military, though. You stayed for 30 years?
Yes.
It's a long time to be in the military. Where else did you serve?
Well, I spent a lot of time in Canada, but then I was an exchange officer with a British Artillery Regiment, 1 RHA, in Germany for 2 years, and which was an interesting time. Spent with the Brits. They're kind of different. Although I know them well, I lived there for 12 years, but you know, they are not the same as Canadians, especially the officer corps. Anyway, then I was posted to Fort Churchill up in Hudson Bay. There's a research rocket range. I was a safety officer on that, and I was the liaison with the Winter Warfare School. The place is closed down now. It doesn't operate as a military base. And then I went to the Canadian Army Staff College in Kingston for a year. And after that, I was promoted to major, and I went to Shiloh as the senior instructor target acquisition. I'd taken the target acquisition course, 6 months course, years before. And this is exactly what it says. It's how to find targets. A lot of it is to do with survey. And then I went off to Cyprus as the senior atom officer for the Canadian contingent. I came back to an intelligence job in Ottawa. And then I did a year as a UN observer on the line of control between the Indians and Pakistanis in Kashmir. Came back to Ottawa. I was still a major, and a major had to retire at 49 in those days, so I was 49, so I retired. But I got a job with military intelligence as a civilian for the next 10 years. And I retired in 1990.
When Remembrance Day comes around and we begin to celebrate and remember our veterans and their service, how do you feel?
I always remember my father.
What do you remember about him?
He was a very quiet individual, never raised his voice. My mother was the boss, like most females. Anyway, he was a nice man.
Was he what inspired you? Was he the inspiration for you to
Well, he told me, you see, a lot of people say, well, these soldiers don't talk about anything, but my father was quite willing to talk to me about his experiences. He was strictly a gunner. He wasn't a sergeant or an officer or anything. He was just one of those guys, bringing up ammunition to the guns, manning an 18-pounder, and that's how he got wounded. He was in a gun pit when the shell exploded outside. This is at Passchendaele. And of the 6 guys, 3 of them were killed and 3 were rather badly wounded. My father, of course, being one of them. And but he would talk about, you know, bringing up the ammunition and the horses and life. He certainly didn't suffer from post-traumatic stress.
Thank you for being here today. It's been a pleasure to be able to speak with you, and thank you also for your service to the country.
Thank you.